It all began on a dusty trail when a lonely cowboy stumbled upon something he never imagined, a wounded giant Apache girl, lying broken and abandoned under the burning sun. Helping her meant risking his life, but walking away would have haunted him forever. What he didn't know was that this single act of kindness would lead him into the heart of an ancient tribe, through trials of fire, and into a choice that demanded a price no man could have expected. Where are you watching from? Comment below, and now let's begin. The desert was not a place for the faint-hearted. By day, the sun turned the earth into a blazing skillet, baking every stone, every grain of sand, until the heat rippled in the air like liquid fire. By night, the world froze under a ceiling of stars so sharp and bright that they looked like 1,000 cold eyes watching from the heavens. The land stretched endlessly, broken only by jagged rocks and the occasional twisted mesquite tree clinging stubbornly to life. It was here, in this merciless expanse where life was as fragile as a drop of water, that a cowboy rode alone. His hat sagged low, the brim cracked and sun-bleached from years of weathering storms and summers. His boots were scuffed, his coat frayed, his saddle patched together more with hope than leather. He wasn't a man of wealth or renown. He was just a wanderer, a poor cowboy with no destination, carrying only the weight of memories he never spoke of. His horse, a bony chestnut with a limp in its step, moved with the patience of an animal that had seen too many miles and too little grass. Together, they looked like two forgotten souls drifting across a land that had no mercy for the weak. The cowboy's stomach gnawed with hunger, but he was used to it. Hunger had been his companion longer than any friend or woman had been. He hadn't had steady work in months, and when he did find it, it was never enough to lift him out of the dust. Still, there was something in his walk, in the way he held the reins, that spoke of quiet resilience. This was a man the desert hadn't beaten yet, though it tried every day. That evening, as the horizon bled red and purple, he slowed his horse near a dry creek bed. The wind had gone still, and the silence was so complete it pressed against his ears. Silence in the desert was never a good thing. Coyotes usually howled, crickets sang, and owls called from the cliffs. But tonight, there was nothing. He frowned, pulling the horse to a stop. His eyes, weathered and sharp from years of survival, scanned the emptiness. And then he heard it. Faint, distant, carried on the still air like a ghost, a sound that didn't belong. It wasn't the cry of an animal or the whisper of shifting sand. It was heavier, a low, ragged groan. Human. The cowboy slid off his horse, boots crunching softly against gravel. His hand instinctively touched the revolver at his side, though something told him this wasn't danger in the usual sense. The sound came again, clearer this time, a desperate voice tangled with pain. He moved cautiously, creeping along the rocks, until he saw her. At first, he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him, for the figure lying half-hidden among the stones was unlike anything he had ever seen. She was a girl, no, a woman, but massive, towering even in her collapsed state. Her limbs stretched long and powerful, her frame broad, her body easily twice the size of any woman he'd ever known. Blood streaked her side where a deep wound glistened, soaking the earth beneath her. Her dark hair spilled around her like a river of night, and her skin, painted with faint streaks of ochre and ash, marked her as Apache. But she was not like any Apache he had seen before. She was something more, something out of legend, a giant. The cowboy froze. His heart pounded in his chest, torn between instinct and morality. Helping an Apache was already dangerous. The tribes did not forgive trespasses easily, and white men in their lands were often greeted with arrows before questions. But this was different. She was not just Apache. She was otherworldly, a giant girl, wounded, helpless, lying in the open desert where vultures already circled above. If he helped her, and her people found him near her, they'd kill him without a second thought. If he left her, she would die, and no one would ever know or care. Except him. His hand trembled as he pulled off his hat and wiped the sweat from his brow. He told himself to walk away, to mount his horse, ride on, and pretend he had never heard the sound. That was the smart thing. That was the safe thing. But the cowboy had lived long enough with the ghosts of choices like that. He had once turned away when someone needed him most, and the memory had never stopped gnawing at him. He thought of the family he had lost years ago, the screams he couldn't silence, the faces he couldn't forget. No, he couldn't walk away. Not again. He crouched beside her, the ground warm beneath his knees. Up close, she was even more astonishing. Her chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, each one rattling as though dragged from deep within her. Her skin glistened with sweat, her lips cracked from thirst. She turned her head slightly, her eyes fluttering open. They were the color of storm clouds, fierce even through the haze of pain. For a heartbeat, they locked on his, and the cowboy felt as though the desert itself had gone still again. She tried to speak, her voice hoarse, thick with her language, but he caught fragments, words of warning, words of fear. He hushed her softly, though his voice was rough as gravel. Easy now, don't waste your strength. He reached for his canteen, tipping it carefully to her lips. She drank greedily, coughing between gulps, water dripping down her chin. Then she slumped again, her body trembling. The cowboy looked at the wound in her side. It was deep, a cut from a blade, jagged and ugly. Whoever had done this wanted her dead. He sat back on his heels, staring at the fading light. He knew what this meant. If he stayed, if he helped her, he'd be taking on more than just a wounded stranger. He'd be walking into the heart of danger, into the path of her people, into the wrath of whoever had struck her down. But if he didn't, her blood would stain the desert, and her story would end here, nameless, forgotten. The cowboy exhaled, a slow, steady breath. His hands still shook, but he pushed them against her wound anyway, pressing cloth torn from his shirt into the gash to stop the bleeding. She gasped, her whole body tensing, but she didn't cry out. He worked quickly, his mind racing. He had no medicine, no proper bandages, nothing but his stubborn will. But sometimes that was enough. Sometimes stubborn will was all a man had. The desert night fell around them, stars igniting overhead. Coyotes finally broke the silence with their mournful cries. The cowboy sat by the fire he built, glancing at her every few seconds, making sure her chest still rose and fell. His horse grazed nearby, restless, ears flicking toward the darkness as if sensing trouble. The cowboy knew he should fear what was coming, knew that the drums of the Apache might already be echoing on the horizon, that they might already be on his trail. But he couldn't think of that now. All he could think of was the fragile line between life and death lying beside him, a giant Apache girl, wounded, vulnerable, and placed in his hands by fate. And as he stared into the fire, his decision settled heavy in his chest. He had chosen mercy, knowing it might cost him his life. He had chosen to help her, though it might bring the wrath of her tribe. The desert was quiet again, but inside him, a storm had begun. The night dragged on with the weight of eternity. The cowboy sat with his back against a boulder, staring at the wounded giant Apache girl lying in the glow of his meager fire. The flames licked upward, shadows dancing across her face, revealing a mixture of strength and fragility he could not reconcile. Her breath was ragged, uneven, as though each inhale was a battle. He had done what little he could, torn strips from his shirt to bind her side, pressed cloth into her wound until the bleeding slowed, given her sips of water. But her body was fevered now, heat rolling off her like the desert sun. Infection. He knew the signs all too well. He had seen men die slower deaths from festering wounds than from bullets. His hands flexed helplessly as he watched her stir, her enormous fingers twitching against the dirt, her lips parting to whisper words he didn't understand. He leaned forward, listening. Her voice was soft, weak, yet it carried the weight of something urgent. Apache words, broken, tangled, but in between he caught faint fragments in English. Hunted, danger, don't stay. Her eyes fluttered, storm-colored irises flashing as they tried to focus on him. For a heartbeat, she gripped his wrist, her hand engulfing his with terrifying ease, the size of her palm swallowing his rough, calloused fingers. She had strength, even like this, but it flickered like a dying flame. He hushed her again, whispering words he wasn't sure she understood. Rest. Save your strength. But he couldn't silence the echo of her warning. Hunted. Danger. His gut twisted. She wasn't just hurt. Someone had done this to her deliberately, men who thought themselves predators, cruel enough to take on something as fierce and legendary as a giant Apache girl. Whoever they were, they wouldn't stop until they were sure she was dead. And if they tracked her this far into the desert, they might not be far behind. The cowboy's gaze drifted to the edges of the night, his eyes scanning the horizon where the stars met the earth. The silence pressed heavy against his ears. His horse shifted uneasily, ears pinned back. Instinct told him trouble was out there, waiting. He chewed the inside of his cheek, torn between flight and stubborn resolve. He could put her on his horse, maybe drag her to the next settlement. But the nearest town was days away, and she wouldn't survive the journey. He could leave her, save his own skin, but the thought of her blood soaking into the sand while he rode away gnawed at him. No, he couldn't do it. He had made his choice. He rose slowly, stretching his sore legs. The firelight painted him in flickers of orange, highlighting the creases of exhaustion on his face. From his stillbag, He pulled the last of his supplies, a small pouch of dried beans, a half-empty canteen, and a length of coarse thread with a rusted needle. He wasn't a doctor, but out here in the desert, you learn to stitch wounds or bury friends. He knelt beside her again, swallowing the lump of fear in his throat as he studied the torn flesh at her side. It was deep, jagged, probably from a long knife or a short sword. Whoever wielded it had been determined to cut her down. "This'll hurt," he muttered softly, though he wasn't sure if she could hear him. With hands that trembled only slightly, he threaded the needle, lit it briefly in the flame to clean it, and began. Her body jerked at the first stitch, her breath hitching in pain. He winced but forced himself to continue, each pull of the thread a desperate prayer that he was buying her more time. By the time he tied off the last knot, sweat slicked his forehead and his hands ached, but the bleeding had slowed. He pressed his palm against the makeshift bandage and whispered hoarsely, "Hold on, girl. You're stronger than this. Don't let the desert take you." For a long while, there was nothing but the crackle of the fire and the sigh of the wind returning across the rocks. She slept again, though her body shivered with fever. The cowboy sat back, his exhaustion heavy. He should have slept too, but sleep was a luxury he couldn't afford. Instead, he found his mind drifting. He thought of the past he had buried under silence, a wife he had once loved, a child whose laugh had been the only music he needed. But the frontier was cruel. Raiders, outlaws, and endless feuds had stripped him of them, leaving him with nothing but the ache of guilt. He had failed to protect them. That was why he rode alone now, chasing horizons he never caught, running from memories that clung like shadows. And maybe that was why he couldn't abandon this girl. Saving her wouldn't bring back what he had lost, but it might silence, even for a moment, the voice inside him that whispered he was a coward. Hours passed. The fire burned low, and he fed it with scraps of wood he had gathered. The night air chilled, biting at his skin. He pulled his tattered coat tighter and glanced again at her. In sleep, her face softened. She looked impossibly young, despite her size. Vulnerable. He noticed markings along her arms and shoulders, faint tattoos or paint, curling lines and symbols he didn't understand. Sacred, maybe. Protective. She wasn't just a girl from a tribe. She was something more, a bearer of her people's legends, a living fragment of their myths. Suddenly, she stirred. Her eyes snapped open, wide with fear. She pushed up slightly, a hand reaching toward him as if to strike, but her body betrayed her, collapsing again under its own weight. Her breath came quick, frantic. He caught her hand gently, speaking low, steady. "Easy now. You're safe." She blinked at him, sweat glistening on her brow. Then, slowly, she spoke. The words were broken, her English strained, but enough to send a chill down his spine. They come back. Not stop. Kill me, kill all." His throat tightened. Whoever had done this wasn't finished. They wanted her dead because she was dangerous, because she meant something. And if they were bold enough to attack her, they wouldn't hesitate to kill anyone in their way, including him. The cowboy sat in silence for a long time, staring into the darkness beyond the firelight. He could feel the desert pressing in on him, a vast emptiness filled with unseen eyes. He had lived his life running, avoiding fights that weren't his. But now, sitting beside this giant girl bleeding into his bandages, he knew he was caught in something bigger than himself. A wound too deep, a secret too heavy, and yet, he couldn't walk away. He leaned forward, speaking quietly, almost as if confessing to himself. "I don't know why I'm here. Don't know why I found you. But I reckon, maybe it's the first thing that makes sense in a long time. So I'll keep you alive. Whatever it takes." She didn't answer. Her eyes fluttered closed again, her body surrendering to exhaustion. The cowboy stayed awake, listening to the night, his hand never straying far from the revolver at his side. He knew the desert wasn't empty anymore. Somewhere out there, men were hunting. And come dawn, the price of his choice might arrive at his doorstep. But for now, under the cold watch of the stars, he kept the fire burning and whispered one last vow to the silence. "You're not dying tonight. Not while I've still got breath in me." And as the wind carried the faint sound of drums from somewhere far across the desert, he realized the story he had stepped into was only just beginning. The dawn came slow, bleeding red over the desert horizon. The cowboy sat where he had sat all night, his back stiff, his eyes hollow from the weight of sleepless hours. The fire had burned to embers, glowing faintly in the half-light, while the wounded giant girl still lay motionless under his tattered blanket. The fever had taken her deep, but she was alive, her chest rising and falling, each breath a victory wrung from the cruel hand of the desert. He rubbed at his eyes, grit and dust scratching at his lids, and exhaled a long, weary sigh. His body ached, but he dared not move too far from her side. Out here, in the endless silence, he felt less like a savior and more like a man holding back the tide with his bare hands. His horse grazed nervously nearby, head jerking up at every shift of the wind. That unsettled him. Horses knew things men didn't, felt danger before it showed its face. He followed its gaze toward the north, where the land rose in jagged ridges, the kind that swallowed sound and carried whispers. He heard nothing but the wind, but the unease stuck to him like burrs. Whoever had wounded this girl, they hadn't finished their work. The desert wasn't empty, it was waiting. Hours later, as the sun climbed, she stirred. A groan escaped her throat, low and pained, but her eyes cracked open. The cowboy leaned forward, shading her face from the glare with his hand. She blinked at him, those storm-colored eyes still heavy with fever, but sharper now, more aware. For a moment, she looked at him as if measuring the truth of his presence, whether he was real, or just another cruel mirage conjured by the desert heat. Her lips moved, whispering something in Apache, her voice rasping like sandpaper. He shook his head gently. "Don't waste your breath, girl. I'm still here." She swallowed hard, then tried again, slower, her English broken but clear enough. "Why, help me?" The question was simple, but it cut deep. He sat back on his heels, staring at the dirt. He could have said nothing, could have shrugged it off, but her eyes held him, pulling the truth from a place he didn't often visit. "Because I couldn't ride away this time," he said quietly. "Not again." She frowned faintly, confusion mingling with pain, but her strength gave out before she could ask more. She turned her face away, sighing, and for the first time since he had found her, she seemed less like a wounded creature and more like a person, wary, fragile, yet still clinging to life. The cowboy fetched his canteen, helping her drink. She sipped greedily, coughing but refusing to let go of the water until she had drained it to the last drop. He couldn't help but chuckle softly, though there was no humor in it. "You'll leave me with nothing if you keep that up." But there was no bite to his words. Truth be told, he didn't mind. If it kept her alive, he'd drink sand himself. Over the next day, she drifted between sleep and waking, her fever breaking in waves. When she was awake, she tried to speak, sometimes in her tongue, sometimes in fractured English. He listened, patient, even when he didn't understand. Slowly, piece by piece, he gathered fragments of her story. She had been ambushed. Not by rival tribes, as he first suspected, but by men from outside, bounty hunters, she called them. They had tracked her for days, waiting for the moment to strike. Their reason was as cruel as it was simple: fear. They feared what her people represented, the strength of her bloodline, the whispers of giants that roamed the canyons. They wanted to kill her to send a message. No legend, no spirit, no tribe could stand against the greed of men with guns. The cowboy listened, each word weighing heavier than the last. He knew the type. He'd seen them before, men who carved their names into the land with bullets and cruelty, who hunted not for justice but for coin. He hated them, hated the hollow look in their eyes when they spoke of killing like it was sport. That she had survived their attack at all was a miracle. At night, when the fire crackled low and the desert wind whistled through the rocks, they spoke more. She told him her name in a whisper, a name he could not quite shape with his tongue, long and lyrical, carrying meaning beyond his language. He tried, stumbling over the syllables until she smiled faintly, correcting him. To make it easier, she allowed him to call her Tayanita, which she explained meant young sister of the mountains. The name fit her, vast, strong, yet vulnerable in ways mountains could be when storm and time broke them down. In return, he told her little of himself. He gave her his name, though it sounded plain and small beside hers. He told her he was just a drifter, a man without a home, scraping by on the edges of the frontier. But in the quiet spaces between words, he shared fragments, a wife's laugh he still remembered, a child's toy he once carved, the night he lost everything and walked into the desert alone. She listened, eyes soft, never pitying, just absorbing the pain he couldn't hide. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a ghost talking to himself. Their bond grew in the silence more than the words. She ate from his meager supplies, tearing dried beans and jerky with slow, careful bites. In exchange, she taught him simple Apache words, pointing at the stars, the fire, the earth, naming each in her tongue. He repeated them clumsily, and she laughed, a low, gentle sound that seemed to chase the loneliness from the night. He hadn't heard laughter like that in a long time. But even as the bond grew, the danger lingered. Each night, the cowboy heard things he couldn't explain. The faint echo of drums carried on the wind, so distant he wondered if it was memory or reality. Some nights, coyotes yipped and wailed, scattering suddenly as if spooked by something larger moving through the darkness. Once, he found tracks near the edge of their camp, boot prints, half buried in sand. He said nothing to her, not wanting to stir fear, but his hand rested more often on the revolver at his hip, and he slept with one eye open. Tayanita noticed, though. One night, as they sat by the fire, she fixed him with those storm-colored eyes and said softly, "You afraid?" He shook his head, though it was a lie. "Not for me." Her gaze lingered, as if she could see through him. Then she whispered something that chilled him more than the cold desert wind. "They find us soon." He stared into the flames, the crackle filling the silence. He knew she was right. The men who had wounded her wouldn't stop. They would come back, maybe with more guns, more hunger for blood. And when they did, he would have to make a choice again. That night, he couldn't sleep. He sat awake, watching her breathe, listening to the desert whisper. She had told him enough for him to understand one thing. Her people would come for her too. They would not abandon one of their own, especially not one so important. When they arrived, they would see him, a white cowboy beside their wounded giant girl, and they would not believe mercy had guided his hand. No, they would see him as another predator, another threat. The cowboy rubbed his face, exhaustion pulling at his bones. His future felt as fragile as the fire's last ember, ready to be snuffed out by the smallest wind. But as he looked at her sleeping, her breath shallow but steady, he knew he couldn't regret it. Not yet, for in the whispers they had shared in the dark, in the fragile trust growing between them, he had found something he thought the desert had stolen long ago, a reason to stay, a reason to fight. And somewhere, beyond the ridges, the first faint beat of drums stirred again, louder this time, like the sound of an approaching storm. The days that followed were not quiet ones. Each sunrise came heavy with an unspoken weight, and each night dragged on with a tension that gnawed at the cowboy's heart. He had grown used to the company of the girl, the strange comfort of her presence, the way her giant form, though still weak from her wounds, carried with it a sense of strength and resilience. She would sit near the fire, her dark hair cascading down her shoulders like a flowing river of black silk, and she would tell him fragments of her people's stories. Her words were broken at times, stitched together with gestures and the little English she knew, but the meaning still sank deep. She spoke of the mountains being alive, of the rivers carrying voices, of giants being protectors chosen by the Great Spirit to guard their tribe against enemies who would seek to destroy them. And while he listened, the cowboy often wondered what fate had brought him here, to this patch of desert, to this wounded girl, to this moment that seemed to grow heavier with every passing breath. But the desert never truly stays still. Signs of movement began to creep into his world. On the third morning, as he checked the sparse remains of his supplies, he noticed horse tracks cutting across the distant sand, heading west. The prints were deep, too many for a single rider, too sharp to be wild mustangs. His blood went cold. He had ridden these lands long enough to know what they meant. Someone was out there, scouts or warriors, moving closer. He glanced back at the girl. She sat with her eyes closed, whispering a prayer in her tongue, her hands pressed against her healing wound. He didn't need to ask who the riders were. He already knew. Her people were coming. That night, the air itself seemed to tremble. The wind carried with it a low hum, a sound that was not born of the earth or the coyotes or even the shifting sands. It was rhythmic, pulsing, like a heartbeat rolling across the land. Drums, at first faint, as if carried from another world, but with every gust of wind, they grew louder, more certain. The cowboy froze as the fire crackled between them, his chest tightening with the realization. They were close, close enough that the night carried the sound of their search. He turned his gaze toward the girl, and for the first time since he'd found her, there was something in her eyes that unsettled him. Fear, not of her tribe, but of what would happen when they discovered him at her side. She leaned forward, her voice a low whisper. "You must go." The words struck him harder than he expected. He shook his head slowly. "And leave you here?" "No. You wouldn't last long without someone watching your back." Her brow furrowed, and she struggled to rise, wincing as the healing wound pulled at her side. "If they see you, they kill you. They not listen. They not care." The cowboy swallowed hard. He knew she was telling the truth. Her tribe had no reason to trust him. To them, he would be just another pale-faced drifter, a man out of place in lands that weren't his. Worse, they could believe he was the one who hurt her, that her blood on the sand was his doing. But he couldn't force himself to leave. The image of her lying in that canyon, barely breathing, her giant form sprawled out like a fallen tree, kept flashing before him. He had chosen to help her. That choice bound him now, as tightly as rope around a steer's neck. He set his jaw. If they want me dead, then so be it. But I ain't running, Dut. For a long time, the girl said nothing. Her dark eyes studied him, trying to read the truth of his words. Finally, she leaned back against the rock, her breathing heavy, her voice barely more than a murmur. You, strange man. The days that followed blurred into a haze of waiting. The cowboy couldn't rest. He would ride out at dawn, scouting the ridges, watching for signs. Smoke rose in the distance one morning, thin trails twisting into the sky, far enough to be hidden yet close enough to be seen. The tribe had set camp. At night, the drums continued, joined by chants that rolled across the desert like a storm on the horizon. The sound carried a promise. They were searching, and soon they would find her. The girl seemed torn between hope and dread. Some evenings, she would close her eyes and whisper prayers of gratitude that her people were near. Other times, her hands would tremble as she stared into the flames, her voice low as she warned him of what they might do. They not see heart, only see face. They think all cowboys same. Hunters. Killers. The cowboy would nod, silently acknowledging the truth he couldn't deny. He had seen men of his kind commit unspeakable things, driven by greed, fear, and cruelty. His own heart carried scars from it. Yet he wasn't like them, not anymore. He had nothing left to hunt, no blood left to spill. He was a hollow man, filled only with dust and regret. And yet, here in this strange company, he felt a spark he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something that felt dangerously close to belonging. One night, as the drums pounded in the distance, the girl turned to him with eyes that glistened in the firelight. You should know my name, she whispered. Her voice carried a weight, as if giving it was both a gift and a risk. Naeli. He repeated it softly, letting it linger on his tongue. Naeli. She nodded, her lips curving into the faintest smile. It mean, I love you in my people's tongue. The cowboy froze, his breath caught in his throat. She quickly shook her head, her cheeks warming with color. Not for you. For meaning. For spirit. But the word stayed with him, echoing in his chest. Naeli. He had gone years without saying anyone's name with such care, as though it mattered more than anything else in the world. The following evening, the storm broke. He had gone to the ridge at sunset, his horse restless beneath him. The sky blazed with orange and crimson fire as the sun dipped low, and there, on the horizon, he saw them. Dark shapes on horseback, moving in silence, dozens of them, their shadows stretching long across the desert floor. His heart thundered. This was no scout party. It was a war band. He rode back fast, his throat dry, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. They are here. Naeli's face went pale, though her eyes held something steady, resignation. She stood as tall as her body would allow, gripping the staff she had fashioned from a broken branch. Then it is time. The cowboy wanted to argue, to tell her they could hide, run, escape into the canyons. But the look in her eyes told him it was useless. She wasn't running anymore. Neither was he. The first riders appeared as the moon climbed high, their horses black against the silver glow. Silent shadows moved across the desert floor, fanning out like wolves circling prey. The cowboy felt the weight of every arrow pointed at his chest, though none were yet released. He stood tall beside Naeli, his rifle at his side, though he knew it would mean little against so many. From the shadows, a figure emerged, taller, broader, his body painted in streaks of red and black. The firelight flickered across his face, and the cowboy realized he was staring at a man who could only be the chief. His gaze burned into him, sharp and merciless, before shifting to Naeli. For a heartbeat, silence ruled. Then the chief raised his hand, and the warriors stopped, their horses snorting in the cool night air. The cowboy's mouth went dry. The moment he had dreaded was here. The tribe had found them. Judgment had come. And with it, the question that would decide everything. Would they see him as her savior, or as her captor? The air was so still that night it felt as though the desert itself had stopped breathing. The cowboy's heart pounded against his ribs as the Apache warriors closed in, their silhouettes blotting out the moonlight as they fanned across the canyon floor. The flames of his small fire flickered nervously, and with every snap of the burning wood, he felt the noose of danger tightening around his neck. He stood his ground beside Naeli, her enormous figure weakened but resolute, her dark eyes flashing with both relief at seeing her people and dread at what their judgment might be. The first warrior rode close enough that the cowboy could see the war paint streaking his face, crimson lines like rivers of blood, black marks like the wings of a raven. His horse snorted, its hooves kicking up dust, and with one swift motion the warrior dismounted, bow still drawn and pointed squarely at the cowboy's chest. Dozens more followed, dismounting in unison, surrounding the camp in a ring of silence broken only by the rustle of leather, the creak of bowstrings, and the soft shuffle of moccasins on sand. The cowboy felt the weight of their stares. In their eyes he was nothing but an intruder, a trespasser in lands that had never been his, and a man caught in the worst of circumstances, with their wounded giant girl at his side. He kept his hands low, far from the rifle slung at his shoulder. He knew one wrong move, one twitch of his fingers, would be enough to end him. Then the crowd parted. Out of the circle stepped a man unlike the others, taller, broader, his hair streaked with gray, his presence commanding without the need for words. His face was painted with deliberate care, black lines under his eyes, a single white streak running from his forehead to his chin, like lightning splitting a storm. His chest was bare but strong, marked with scars that told the story of battles survived. He carried no bow in his hands, only a staff carved from cedar, its top crowned with eagle feathers that danced in the night air. Naeli's lips parted, and though her voice trembled, it carried a reverence that stilled even the restless horses. "Father!" The cowbow's breath caught. Father! This man, this towering presence, was the chief. And not just any chief, but the one whose daughter he had pulled from the jaws of death. The chief's gaze cut through the night like a blade. First, his eyes rested on Naeli, his expression betraying a flicker of pain as he saw her injuries. Then, slowly, his gaze turned to the cowboy. It was not the gaze of a curious man, nor a grateful one. It was the unblinking stare of a judge measuring the worth of a condemned soul. "You," the chief said at last, his voice deep, resonant, and cold. His English was clear, though laced with an accent heavy as stone. "Why do you stand beside her?" The cowboy swallowed hard, his throat dry. He wanted to answer, to explain how he had found her bleeding and alone, how he had chosen mercy over indifference. But his voice faltered under the weight of so many eyes. I found her hurt. Left for dead. I couldn't just ride on." A murmur rippled through the warriors. Some sneered, others narrowed their eyes with suspicion. Mercy was not a quality they often saw in men of his kind. The chief stepped closer, the staff striking the ground with each deliberate step. "You expect me to believe you saved her? A pale-faced drifter with no home, no tribe. Men like you bring only death." The cowboy clenched his fists, not in defiance but in desperation. "Believe what you will. I gave her water. I tended her wound. If I meant her harm, she'd be dead already." For the first time since their arrival, Naeli pushed herself forward. Though her body trembled, she stood tall, her voice breaking but firm. "It is true. He saved me. If not for him, I would not be here. He gave me life when the earth wanted to take it." Her words carried weight. The warriors shifted uneasily, their suspicion now tempered by doubt. Yet not all were convinced. One man, younger, his face painted red, stepped forward and spat on the ground at the cowbow's feet. "Lies. He is weak. He seeks favor to buy his life. He should die." The chief raised his hand, silencing the outburst. His eyes never left the cowbow's face. "If what my daughter says is true, then you have done something no outsider has done before. But mercy does not erase blood already spilled. My daughter lies wounded because of men who hunt her. Are you not one of them?" The question cut like a knife. The cowboy shook his head fiercely. "I've hunted cattle. I've chased coin. But I've never hunted people. Not her. Not anyone like her. You've got my word." A silence fell, heavy and suffocating. Then the chief turned, speaking to his people in their tongue. The cowboy couldn't understand the words, but he could feel the weight of the debate, voices rising, hands gesturing, some pointing at him as if he were a snake to be crushed, others glancing at Naeli with respect for her testimony. Finally, the chief raised his staff, and silence returned. He looked once more at the cowboy. "You will not die tonight. But you will not walk free. You come with us. You will stand before our fire. There, the spirits will decide if your words are truth." Two warriors stepped forward instantly, seizing the cowboy by the arms. Their grip was like iron, their eyes filled with distrust. He didn't resist. Resistance would be suicide. He glanced at Naeli, who gave him the faintest nod, her expression torn but resolute. They dragged him through the night, away from his small camp, away from the safety of the canyon walls. The march was long, the desert cold biting through his thin coat. Torches flickered in the hands of warriors, casting wild shadows across the sand. Ahead, he could see the glow of a great fire rising against the night sky, its light growing brighter with every step. When they finally entered the village, his breath caught. It was unlike anything he had imagined. Dozens of towering structures built of wood and hide, arranged in a circle around a massive fire pit. The flames roared high, casting golden light on the painted faces of men, women, and children who gathered silently, their eyes fixed on him with a mix of awe and suspicion. He felt like an animal paraded into an arena, every heartbeat echoing in his ears. The warriors shoved him forward until he knelt before the fire. The chief stepped into the circle, Naeli at his side, her wound bound but her body still weak. The drums began to beat again, low, steady, like the heartbeat of the earth itself. The firelight danced in the eyes of the tribe, and the cowboy realized this was not just judgment. This was ceremony. The chief raised his staff high, his voice booming over the flames. This man claims mercy. He claims he saved the blood of my blood. But the earth has seen many lies. Tonight, the spirits will speak. The cowboy bowed his head, his heart thundering. He had no tribe, no spirits, no one to call on but himself. Yet here, under the gaze of giants, he felt the weight of destiny pressing down on him. He had chosen mercy once. Now he would pay whatever price that choice demanded. The drums grew louder. The fire roared higher. The circle closed tighter. And the cowboy knew his fate rested in the hands of people who might see him as savior, or strike him down as an enemy. The fire roared so high it seemed to lick at the stars, casting its glow across every face in the circle. Shadows leapt and twisted on the walls of the wooden lodges, flickering like restless spirits called to witness the trial. The cowboy knelt in the dirt, his hands bound behind him with rawhide, his head lowered, the heat of the flames kissing his skin. He could feel the weight of 100 eyes on him, eyes that judged without mercy, eyes that saw him as nothing more than another pale intruder trespassing on sacred ground. The drumbeat thudded steady, like the pulse of the earth itself, filling his chest with a rhythm he could not escape. Across the fire, the chief stood tall, his painted face solemn, his staff planted firmly in the earth as though it anchored the entire village. Beside him was Naeli, her body still weak but her spirit unbending. Her gaze darted between her father and the cowboy, fear and hope wrestling in her dark eyes. She knew, as he did, that tonight was no small judgment. Tonight would decide whether mercy had been a blessing or a curse. The chief raised his staff high, and the drums ceased as if cut by a blade. Silence spread through the village like a tide. Even the desert wind seemed to hold its breath. This man, the chief began, his voice low and heavy, rolling over the circle, claims to have shown mercy. He claims to have saved the life of my daughter, blood of my blood, spirit of our people. Yet mercy is not free. It is never free. His eyes swept the crowd, then fell hard on the cowboy. Every act has a price, and the spirits demand balance. If his hands are clean, if his heart speaks truth, then he will pay the price that mercy commands. The cowboy lifted his chin, sweat dripping from his brow. He wanted to ask what that price was, but the fire in the chief's gaze silenced him. He understood now. This was not a trial of words. This was a trial of spirit. The chief extended his hand toward Naeli. Daughter, speak. Did this man save you? Tell your people what you saw. Naeli took a step forward, her giant frame trembling slightly, but her voice rang strong. Yes, I was hunted, struck down by cowards who feared our blood. They left me to die in the canyon. This man found me. He gave me water, fire, food. He tended my wound. He stayed when he could have left me to the earth. She turned her gaze on the tribe, then on her father. Without him, I would not stand here tonight. A murmur rippled through the crowd, some nodding with respect, others scowling in distrust. The chief studied her for a long moment, then shifted his gaze back to the cowboy. You speak truth through my daughter, but truth alone does not cleanse you. You are not of our blood, not of our ways. The earth remembers the harm of your kind. His voice grew colder. So you will pay the price. At his signal, 2 warriors stepped forward and seized the cowboy by the shoulders, dragging him upright. His knees burned where they scraped the dirt, but he didn't fight. The chief walked around him slowly, the staff tapping against the earth with each step. The price is not gold. The price is not cattle. These things are worthless in the eyes of the spirits. The price is heavier. The price is life for life. The cowboy's stomach tightened. His voice cracked as he forced the words out. Life for life. You mean, mine for hers. The chief stopped in front of him, his shadow stretching long in the firelight. Not death, he said slowly, but service. You took her burden when you chose to save her. Now you will carry it until the balance is restored. Confusion and dread twisted in the cowboy's chest. Service? What kind of service? The chief's eyes burned with unshakable resolve. The men who hunted her will come again. They are many, armed with iron and fire. They will return for what they failed to take. You will fight beside us when they come. You will bleed with us. You will stand as one of us, or you will be nothing. The words struck like thunder. For a moment the cowboy couldn't breathe. Fight? With them? Against bounty hunters armed with rifles and greed? He was just one man, a drifter with a worn-out horse and no one left in the world. He had spent his life running from battles, not standing in them. Yet now, bound and surrounded by giants, he realized the truth. He had no choice. One of the warriors spat at his boots. He is weak. He will fall at the first shot. Another, older and scarred, shook his head. Perhaps. But he saved her. That means the spirits have marked him. The chief raised his staff again, silencing the voices. He turned to the cowboy one last time. This is the price. Stand with us when the hunters return. Prove your heart is true. Or fall, and let the earth take back what you borrowed. The cowboy's throat tightened. He thought of the canyon, of Nayeli bleeding into the sand. He thought of how easy it would have been to leave her there, to ride on and forget. But he hadn't. He had chosen mercy, and mercy had brought him here, before a fire that threatened to consume him. His voice was hoarse, but it carried enough strength to echo in the silence. I'll stand with you. When the hunters come, I'll fight. The words seemed to hang in the air, suspended between the fire and the stars. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the chief struck his staff into the ground with a resounding crack. So it is decided. The price of mercy is paid in courage. He will fight beside us. The crowd erupted, some in approval, some in anger. The younger warriors scowled, muttering of weakness and betrayal, while the elders nodded solemnly, seeing the hand of the spirits in what had unfolded. Nayeli's shoulders sagged with relief. She looked at the cowboy, her lips parting in the faintest smile. It was not a smile of triumph, but of gratitude, a silent thank you for the burden he had agreed to carry. The warriors untied his hands, shoving him back to his knees. His wrists burned where the rawhide had cut his skin, but he didn't rub them. He kept his eyes on the fire, the crackling flames reflecting the turmoil in his chest. He was no longer a drifter free to wander the desert. He was bound now, not by rope, but by a promise heavier than chains. That night, they placed him in a small lodge on the edge of the village, guarded by two warriors who never let their bows dip. He lay awake on the dirt floor, staring at the smoke hole above him, where stars twinkled faintly through the rising haze. His mind churned with fear. He had agreed to fight, but he didn't know if he had it in him anymore. He had spent years running from gunfights, from the ghosts of his past. Could he really stand shoulder to shoulder with these giants when death came for them all? And yet, even as doubt clawed at him, another thought settled deep in his chest. For the first time in years, he wasn't alone. For the first time since the loss that had hollowed him out, someone had looked at him, not as a failure, not as a drifter, but as a man who mattered. The price of mercy was steep, but maybe, just maybe, it would be worth paying. The days after Lone Hawk's words hung in the air were like walking a razor's edge for Daniel. The camp seemed at once alive with quiet anticipation and yet suffocating in its silence. Conversations halted when he entered. Old women, their faces calved with years of grief and wisdom, whispered among themselves. Young warriors sharpened their spears and bows with deliberate motions, their eyes flicking toward him with equal parts suspicion and calculation. Children who had once darted past him with giggles now clung to their mother's skirts, wide-eyed, as though the white stranger might vanish or explode at any moment. Only Aita offered him solace. When she walked into the clearing, her tall form silhouetted against the red wash of evening, Daniel felt the weight of the tribe's stairs lessen. Her presence was like a shield, fragile, but protective. She would sit beside him at the fire, speaking softly in English and Apache, her voice carrying both strength and vulnerability. She told him of her people's struggles, land stolen, families torn apart, promises broken again and again by men who wore badges or uniforms. Her words were not meant to wound him but to remind him of the chasm he stood over. He was one man, but in their eyes, he bore the weight of an entire history of betrayal. Then, one fateful morning, Lone Hawk summoned Daniel to the council fire. The warriors gathered in a circle, their feathered headdresses catching the light of dawn, their faces painted with solemn patterns that marked tradition and resolve. Smoke from the sacred fire curled upward, carrying the scent of sage and cedar, and silence blanketed the camp until Lone Hawk spoke. "You have saved Aita," Lone Hawk began, his deep voice rolling like distant thunder. "You tended her wounds when others would have left her to die. For this, we honor you. But trust is not given freely. Trust has a price." Daniel shifted uneasily. "Name it," he said, his voice quiet but steady. A murmur ran through the circle, like dry leaves stirred by the wind. Lone Hawk's gaze did not waver. "You will take part in the trial of fire." Daniel frowned. "The trial of fire?" An older woman with eyes as sharp as a hawk leaned forward. "It is our way of knowing a man's spirit. If you are true, you will endure. If you are false, the fire will consume you." Daniel's stomach tightened. He had faced outlaws, storms, starvation, but this was different. He looked at Aita, standing at the edge of the circle, her eyes wide, lips parted in protest. She stepped forward, but Lone Hawk raised a hand, halting her. "It must be done," the chief said. The trial was set for sundown. Until then, Daniel moved through the camp as though in a haze. Warriors watched him, testing his courage with every glance. Aita followed close, speaking urgently in hushed tones. "You do not understand," she said. "The trial of fire is not just a test. It can kill you." Daniel stopped, his hands on her shoulders. "Then tell me what it means. Tell me how to survive it." Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "It is not about strength of body, but strength of heart. They will place you before the flames. You must walk through them. If you walk with fear, the fire will burn you. If you walk with truth, the fire will leave you unharmed." Daniel stared at her. "That sounds like madness." Aita's grip tightened on his arm. "It is faith. My people believe the fire knows what is hidden in a man's soul." The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in blood-red streaks. Drums began to beat, slow and steady, echoing through the canyon. The entire tribe gathered around a great pit where wood had been stacked high and set ablaze. The fire roared, sparks leaping into the darkening sky like spirits released from the earth. The heat was suffocating, pressing against Daniel's skin, searing his throat with every breath. Lone Hawk raised his arms. "Tonight, the white man proves his heart. He claims to honor our daughter. He claims to walk with respect. Let the fire decide if his words are truth." The crowd murmured, voices rising with excitement and doubt. Aita stood at the edge, her hands clasped tightly, her lips moving in silent prayer. Daniel stepped forward, his boots crunching on the dirt. The flames towered before him, their light flickering across the faces of the tribe. Sweat trickled down his brow, but his eyes remained fixed on the inferno. He thought of the first time he saw Aita, lying broken and bleeding in the grass. He thought of the nights tending her wounds, of the songs she whispered in a tongue he barely understood, of the trust that had grown like fragile roots between them. He thought of the faces around him now, some filled with hatred, others with hope. And he thought of the land itself, vast and untamed, demanding respect from all who walked it. With a deep breath, Daniel stepped into the flames. The heat hit him like a wall, blistering, suffocating. For an instant, panic clawed at his chest, urging him to turn back. But then he heard Aita's voice, soft, steady, whispering his name. He forced himself forward, one step, then another. The fire licked at his clothes, but somehow, impossibly, the flames did not consume him. The tribe gasped. Warriors leaned forward, eyes wide with disbelief. Elders whispered prayers, their hands raised to the sky. Daniel kept walking, his eyes fixed on the other side. His legs trembled, his skin stung, but he did not falter. He emerged from the fire, smoke curling from his clothes, his chest heaving with each breath. Silence gripped the camp. Then Lone Hawk rose to his feet, his expression unreadable. Slowly, deliberately, he nodded. "The fire has spoken," he said. "The white man walks with truth." A roar erupted from the tribe. Some cheered, some wept, and others stared at Daniel with awe. Aita rushed forward, throwing her arms around him, tears streaming down her face. But as the fire crackled behind them, Daniel saw something in Lone Hawk's eyes, a shadow of doubt, or perhaps a warning. This trial had earned him survival, perhaps even respect. But trust was not yet his. That night, as the tribe celebrated with dances and chants, Daniel sat beside Aita, his body aching, his mind restless. He had walked through fire and lived. But what price would come next? For though he had survived the trial, he could feel the weight of another storm gathering, one far more dangerous than flames. The tribe had not asked for his life. Not yet. But the true cost of saving Aita was only beginning to unfold, and Daniel knew deep down that the price they demanded might reach far beyond what he had imagined. And when Lone Hawk approached him again at dawn, his eyes grave, his words confirmed that fear. "You have proven your heart," the chief said. "But now, you must prove your loyalty. The time has come for the true price." When dawn broke across the canyon, the fires of the trial had burned down to a bed of glowing embers, but their heat still clung to the earth. Daniel barely slept through the night. His body still carried the sting of smoke, his muscles heavy with exhaustion. Yet it wasn't his body that weighed him down the most. It was Lone Hawk's words echoing in his mind. "Now you must prove your loyalty. The time has come for the true price." Daniel rose to meet the day, boots crunching on the dusty soil as the sun bled across the horizon. He felt every gaze upon him. No longer suspicion alone, something more complicated now, expectation, curiosity, and perhaps a fragile thread of respect. But he also sensed that this wasn't over, that the fire had only been the beginning. When Lone Hawk called him to the council circle once more, the air carried a different tension, heavier and sharper than before. The elders sat in a semicircle, faces grave and painted with sacred symbols. Warriors stood around them like stone statues, their spears glinting in the morning light. Aita lingered at the edge, her eyes searching Daniel's, silently pleading for fate to be merciful. Lone Hawk's voice carried over the silence. "The fire has judged your heart true. But a man's heart is only one part of him. The question remains, where does his loyalty lie? With his people, or with ours?" Daniel swallowed, his throat dry. "I've done all I can to prove myself. I saved Aita. I walked through your fire. What more do you want?" Lone Hawk's eyes narrowed. "We want your choice." The old chief leaned forward, his voice low, deliberate. "You will never return to your people. You will remain here, among us, and become one of us, or you will leave now, never to return, and know that Aita will not follow." The words struck Daniel harder than any bullet or blade. His chest tightened, his mind spun. "Stay! Leave!" The two paths stretched before him like roads through an endless desert, each carrying a cost he wasn't sure he could bear. Aita stepped forward, her voice trembling but fierce. "Father, no. He saved me when no one else would. He risked his life again and again. Why must he give up everything?" Lone Hawk's face softened only slightly as he looked at her. "Because trust is not built on gratitude. It is built on sacrifice. If he would be one with us, he must cut ties to the world that destroyed us. Only then can we believe in him." The council murmured in agreement. The decision wasn't born of cruelty but of survival, an old, hard law forged by betrayal after betrayal. Daniel looked at Aita. Her tall, proud frame seemed smaller now, trembling under the weight of her father's decree. He saw her pain mirrored in her eyes, the silent plea that asked him to stay, but also the fear of asking him to give up his life. For long moments, Daniel said nothing. His mind drifted back to the dusty plains where he rode cattle as a boy, back to the worn-down ranch house that smelled of leather and hay, back to the grave of his mother, the only family he'd truly known. That world had given him little but loneliness and scars. And yet, it was still his world. And then he thought of Aita, the way she had looked at him when her fever broke, the way her laughter echoed by the river, the way she touched his arm like he wasn't just some drifter, but a man worth something. The silence in the circle thickened. The drums began to beat again, slow and heavy, a reminder that time was running out. Finally, Daniel stepped forward, his voice rough with emotion. "I have no people. I have no home. All I've had is the trail, the dust, and the sound of my own boots on the earth. But when I saved Aita, I found something I didn't know I was looking for. If staying means giving up what little I had, then I'll pay that price. I'll stay." A ripple of shock spread through the council. Aita gasped, covering her mouth with trembling hands. Lone Hawk studied him for a long, unbroken moment. "You would turn your back on your kind?" the chief asked. Daniel's jaw tightened. "My kind never did me any favors. If loyalty is what you want, you have it. I'll stand with Aita. I'll stand with you." The air shifted, as though the entire canyon held its breath. Then Lone Hawk raised his staff and struck it into the earth. "So it is decided. The white man is no longer white. He is of us." The tribe erupted into cries, some of joy, some of disbelief. Children ran forward to touch his hands, elders whispered prayers, warriors nodded with grudging respect. Aita rushed to him, tears streaking her face, and clung to him as though afraid he might vanish if she let go. But even in that embrace, Daniel knew the truth. The price had been paid, but it was steep. He would never see the old trails again, never ride under the stars as a free cowboy, never step foot into a saloon filled with familiar noise. That chapter of his life had closed. Days turned into weeks. Daniel learned the ways of the Apache. He hunted with the warriors, fished with the boys, and listened to the stories told by the elders at night. Slowly, the tribe's suspicion turned into acceptance. The name Stranger faded, replaced by a new name they gave him, Tazakai, the man who walked through fire. Yet even in his new life, Daniel sometimes lay awake at night, staring at the stars, wondering if he had truly chosen his path or if the path had chosen him. Aita would rest her head on his shoulder, whispering in her soft voice, "You gave up your world for me. I will give you mine in return." And in those moments, Daniel felt at peace. But the truth lingered, like a shadow at the edge of firelight. Every choice demands a price. And though he had chosen love over freedom, belonging over solitude, he would forever carry the ghost of the cowboy he once was. Still, when the drums of the tribe echoed through the canyon, when Aita's laughter rang like music through the air, Daniel knew one thing for certain. Whatever he had lost, whatever it had cost, he had gained something greater. And for a man who once had nothing but dust and silence, that was worth any price. And so ends the tale of Daniel, the cowboy who saved a wounded giant Apache girl and paid a price he never expected. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. Thank you for watching.